Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Education Watch Oklahoma. This is our second episode, and we're kicking off a series called Filling in the Gaps, looking at how state and district spending of ESSER dollars can help support students through the pandemic, as K-12 students have suffered the historic barrier to education and sometimes just being a kid. So we've got several guests tonight who are going to talk a little bit about specifically this episode is about the Oklahoma Data Matrix, which is a state assessment resource that was developed by the State Department of Education. That it was very revealing when it was published earlier this fall. It shows that basically every student statewide, no matter their economic status, demographic, what school they went to, suffered academically due to the pandemic. So our first guest tonight, we have Maria Kamek, who is the Deputy Superintendent of Assessment, Accountability, Data Systems, and Research at the Oklahoma State Department of Education. Maria, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Cool. Well, that's a big title. Tell us a little bit about the type of work that you do and what it was like to put together this data matrix.
Sure. So it is a big title. We have quite a big division overseeing all of the assessments. So English learner assessments, and then all of the statewide required assessments that all states are required under federal law to give to students. And then all of our accountability. So our A through F letter grades for our schools in a typical year, we would provide for stakeholders, but we haven't had those for a couple of years with the pandemic, as you know. And then everything in between that with collecting all of the information. And so the data visualizations that I guess you had spoke about, the data matrix, that is something we were really intentional about providing for stakeholders this year. As you said, this has been something we've never seen before in the last couple of years. And so we knew we needed to provide more information publicly to just increase that transparency, because we knew that families and communities really wanted to understand where kids were and how far we might have to address unfinished learning and what supports kids might need to get back on track. So it was really important to give that information in a really user-friendly way. We have a number of different publicly available visualizations that we use in a typical year, but this matrix was really important to provide some additional variables that I can talk a little bit more about in a minute to really contextualize, because we know school experience, student experience was different across the state. No two districts were the same, no two schools were the same in terms of what the students' experience was like with their teachers and their peers. So we wanted to provide that information to help really contextualize a student's experience before you even think about comparing student performance.
Okay. And what were some of the variables that, in terms of context, you're saying every student experienced the pandemic differently, from classroom to classroom, school to school, kid to kid, depending on what their parents were doing, what it was like at home, if they had any learning disabilities, whatever the circumstance may have been, every student was affected differently. But it seemed to be the case that across the board, every student also dealt with some and is dealing with some unfinished learning. So talk a little bit about what inferences can be drawn with the data and what can't.
Yeah, and that's a really great question. And, we like to talk about things with, you have to really be able to describe the information before you can draw inferences. And for the state this year, we really are in a position to only be able to describe that information, but building resources to help districts draw those inferences, because they have more information that is closer to the student, closer to the families, closer to the community's experience, that can really help them understand what a student or classroom or teacher might need. So what I mean by that is, at the state level, we provide different data points. So we provide scores for math and reading and science. We provide participation information. So how many kids actually had an opportunity to test? So if we see that performance looked really high, or in a lot of cases looked really low, you really need to consider how many kids actually took the test. Because in a typical year, about 100% of kids test, about 99% of kids. So you really don't have to consider that. But when we see kind of some differences across the state, where we have some schools that tested 80%, some tested 40%, some tested 100%. So before you can really draw that at the state level, you really have to dig into participation first. So for schools and districts, it's really important that we look at local variables. Look at attendance for the students within a classroom. Look at the teacher's attendance. Was the teacher quarantined? Were they in and out? Were they spun up in virtual classrooms? I know for my own kids, I was home sometimes and I had 3 kids in virtual learning trying to work, and I don't know how much help I was actually able to provide them. So we know those things happened across the state, and they weren't the same, even within a district. So providing those local variables that districts can really dig into would be looking at their local assessments. So we do the statewide summative assessment at the end of the year, but we also know schools give those assessments or those tests every month or every quarter, those benchmark tests. And so it's really important to dig into that information to really understand what a student might need. On the data matrix, we do provide all of this information where you can disaggregate it by student group. As you had mentioned, students that are in need of services or have disabilities or English learners or come from economically disadvantaged households. All of that information at the school and district level is provided, but to draw those inferences, it really needs to happen at the local level.
Okay. And what are some of the resources that the State Department of Ed has provided to, so one note, the state of Oklahoma was like way ahead of other states in getting their test assessments completed and having a way to access that data through a model like the data matrix. And so districts in Oklahoma have had kind of an additional layer of insight into what happened with their students during the pandemic because we have the 2021 summative assessment data. So what type of, I guess, outreach or training or communication has gone out to districts about what they can do with this data and what they kind of can't do with it?
Yeah, that's, it was a lot of, I think, work and a lot of conversations with other states about, what they were doing and trying to get some ideas and get some feedback from districts of what they might need. As you mentioned, Oklahoma was one of the first states to provide that information. So we provided parents and districts that information in June. So that was through the parent portal. So families can log into a parent portal and see their student test scores and history of test results for any time from grades 3 through 8 and grade 11. That's all in a parent portal. And so one of the things that we were really intentional about is looking at the resources that we've had and really trying to extend those for the context of the pandemic. And as I mentioned, there's not a one size fits all for any school or district. So it was really about trying to help model some frameworks or model these analyses that districts could engage with. Once we were able to provide those templates, we spun up some webinars and a series of webinars to really have conversations with schools and districts to help walk them through to really, kind of a if this, flow chart. So if this answer is yes, then go here. If no, then go here. To really try to figure out what makes sense for their school and community. Because, it just complicated things, which is why with the pandemic, not having schools that were similar, which is why most states weren't able to provide this information as quickly, just because there's not really claims and inferences at the state level you can really confidently make.
So you're talking in terms of like basically COVID mitigation policies in schools and were students required to quarantine or, did everybody go virtual or, sort of what types of mitigation procedures were in place? That's what we're referring to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's part of it. And I think that, all of that context comes into play when you look at student scores that have dropped, because we saw that statewide, of course. But the question may be why. We can look at those different policies and strategies. And like I said, the local information that schools would have access to and teachers would have access to understand what a student would need this year to address that unfinished learning.
Okay. Maybe give like a very specific example of, so one of the cautionary notes with this data was that, you can't really compare school to school. So, there wasn't like, oh, look how good this school did. Look how well their students tested versus a school that didn't seem to have done as well because of factors like, well, maybe you had a section of students who were at some sort of economic disadvantage who weren't able to make it to the weekend evening, test time that was assigned to them. So maybe you only had the high scoring students in the classroom or something like that. I mean, talk about like kind of the niche dynamics in a classroom and with the testing that are affecting, or basically kind of give an example of why we can't really compare school to school.
Yeah, and you teed me up perfectly for that because, in a typical year, when I was a teacher, I would want to see how other science teachers performed. That was just what you did when you got your test scores. And I know a lot of principals, they'll pick up the phone and call another neighboring school to say, how are things looking for you guys? But that is where the challenge is this year. And you had mentioned participation rate. So again, it is about who is there to take the assessment. But it's also about who wasn't there to take the assessment. Like you had mentioned, there might be a group of students that didn't have the opportunity to come in and have access to take an assessment. So when you look at that test score as an aggregate, so when you start thinking about it as a classroom, a specific teacher, or a grade level, when you start rolling that information up to a higher level, it becomes more and more complicated, just as you mentioned, because you're not sure exactly who was all there to take the assessment without really digging into the information. And what I mean by that is if you take two schools that are pretty comparable with demographics in a typical year, and in a typical year, they both test 99% of their students. When you look at their performance, you can probably draw some inferences and compare across the two schools. But this year, if you have one school who tested 99% again, but you had another school who only tested 70% of their kids, you need to dig into who were those 70%, but also who were those 30% that didn't test. And by student groups, you need to look at your students with disabilities, your economically disadvantaged, English learners, all the race ethnicity groups, to really think about what groups were there to test. Was there a group that just didn't test at all or had a really low participation? That all might come into play with when you start aggregating that number. So when you start thinking about comparing classrooms, and like I said, at two grade levels, any level of aggregation like that, it adds additional complexity to draw inferences.
Okay. And just so everyone's clear, these aren't variables that usually exist in the state assessment data, which comes out, periodically. So your office has kind of had to pivot and figure out how to present this data in a way that's accurate and without, making logical gaps when you're pointing at two pieces of information. So talk to me about what your office did differently as you approached explaining the information like you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and it really started with us doing our own kind of deep dive into the information. In a typical year, there are some validations that we are able to do before results are provided, but we usually provide results within 10 days of the student testing window. So it's a quick turnaround in a typical year, but with 99% of kids tested, there's not a lot of digging into it that we need to really do. Through the summer, we always have a cleaning time where we go through and give schools an opportunity to make sure they know that they have the accurate information for their school and for their district. But the difference this year is we needed to really build in that time to dig into what things are looking like for different demographics, for grade levels, for schools and districts, so that we could help schools understand. And as we did our own deep dive, then we could take that and model those templates that I had mentioned to provide for schools to say, this is kind of what we see at the state level. Here's some example analyses, and then to kind of walk that through with some schools. And so we piloted it with about 5 different districts. And so we would build a resource and have them try it at their school, and then we'd get feedback of what additional information we could provide until we felt like we really had it in a good place. We sent it out to some other states to see what they thought, and also our technical advisory committee. It's 5 national experts that sit on a board to help us make sure the validity and reliability of our assessment and the results and the interpretations that we are advising schools to be able to draw from the information. And so they were a big part of this rollout, but we definitely spent a lot more time this year than a typical year digging into the information and trying to understand it from our perspective to help schools and districts, because we know a lot is on their plate, and we also know that people really want to understand how to help kids, and so we really want to understand it as well.
Okay. And I wanted to ask you a question about what this means for districts that are trying to, or I guess what does this mean for equity in schools? What does this mean for students who might have suffered a little bit disproportionately during the pandemic? I guess, how does this data kind of shine a light on where those students are and what happened to them during the pandemic?
Yeah, and assessments that are required under federal law is a civil rights check. It is about ensuring students have an opportunity to learn education and grade level expectations at every grade. Yeah, and we check that in grades 3 through 8 and grade 11. But this year it is, and like any year, it is one piece of information. It's a big piece of information, and it tells you quite a bit about your instructional programs at a school and a district level, but it is not the only piece of information. And so if schools see that they had underperforming groups of students or pockets or students that didn't typically underperform, and they are now, it does require further digging. There is not a claim or inference that you can make, but it is about taking that information as kind of the first step. We see that, students dropped or groups of students dropped, and then digging into that information and connecting with school or teachers and families to really understand that student's context this last year and a half, to understand, why did the student perform this way? So it is, again, like a typical year, one piece of information, but it's very important that when schools and districts look at that across their student groups, that they really dig into that information to understand what students might need.
Okay. And Maria, is there any other particular insight that you want to make sure is a part of this conversation this evening?
Yeah, I would just say that, we've got a variety of different platforms for parents, for districts, for schools to dig into this information. And again, it is one piece of information that helps us understand the impact of the pandemic, but it also sets the stage for, spring 2022 that we're coming close to. I mean, in a few months, we'll be getting ready to test again. So it's really going to be helpful, I think, to kind of progress monitor those acceleration efforts that I know schools and districts are working hard to provide for schools or for students. So I think it's a two-pronged approach, is understanding, what has happened the last couple of years, but then also what efforts have been put in place this year with the ESSER dollars, as you mentioned earlier, to really help address that unfinished learning. And so I think when we see those test results this spring, it'll really help us understand how well those programs are working.
Okay. And so there's programs kind of in the works to, maybe focus a bunch of tutoring hours or apply another sort of resource to students that it's maybe, yet to be seen how effective those resources are. And, this is kind of an interesting moment in terms of coming up with resources for accelerating, like you said, accelerating a student. I guess have there been any kind of like key resources that have jumped out to you that you feel might get a gold star out of all of this?
Besides the data matrix itself, I think that is a great opportunity. Inside the data matrix, there's a couple other visualization platforms that are more targeted towards schools and district leaders. But the visualization, I think we did a great job, and it is something that has been showcased nationally several times already, because we wanted to provide the state map by county, and we've never done that before, because we also know that COVID cases were traced by county, so we wanted to be able to have a map that was similar to where a parent could get in there and see their county at different participation rates across the state, and then dig into schools within that county and schools within that district. So I think out of anything, that is probably the gold star. And I think it might look a little different for families and for district and school leaders, but it is something that we are really proud of and hope that people have found it useful.
Okay. Well, Maria, I can't thank you enough for being on and for breaking down all of your expertise for us. I just really appreciate you coming on and explaining all of this.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Well, have a great rest of your evening. And up next, we are going to talk with a Moore Public Schools Administrator. Shannon Woodson is the Dean of Academics. And I'm going to ask her a little bit about, on the district level now, we've had this data matrix. We've gotten a lot of information. There's been lots of conversations about resource solutions for unfinished learning. Maybe just talk to me a little bit about, Shannon, how are the students at Moore Public Schools doing? Oh, and you're muted.
Thank you for having.
There we go.
Thank you for having us join you today.
Absolutely.
I really appreciated what Maria said about the caution of comparing schools. You were a pretty competitive district, and we like to look at our neighboring districts to make sure that our students are competing. But we really had to back away from that this year because we understand that every district situation was unique. And we had not received test data from 2020 because our students didn't test in the year of 2020. So we were really comparing that 2019 data to the 2021 data. And to be quite frank, we do a pretty good job of benchmarking with a national normed assessment tool for all of our K-8 students. And so I have been really relying on that data because we actually had assessed our students on January, in January of 2020, before we dismissed for COVID during that last quarter. And so when we came back in the fall of 2020, I compared our back to school data from that assessment to the last test that those students had taken the previous January. And it was alarming, to be honest with you, how far some of our students slipped. As far as trends, we noticed that our early childhood students slipped a lot further than our middle school and high school students in that intermediate elementary level. We had quite a bit of regression with especially our second graders, the students who would have been first grade when we had to go home for the pandemic in the spring of 2020. The irony there is when I compared that data last spring, we had really made great gains in early childhood. They seemed to remediate a lot faster. And so by the time we left, isn't that interesting? So by the time we left in May of 21, they had pretty much caught back up. I was very pleased to see that they had caught back up during that 2021 school year. Where we seem to have the biggest discrepancy now is in that middle level, that 5th through 8th grade. And as we know, that's a very challenging time of life for students anyway. And that is where we seem to be as a district struggling to remediate and make up for that lost and unfinished learning. That's what our benchmark data showed us.
Showing you right now. And then how frequently are you getting this kind of benchmark assessment in your K-8?
Well, we do it 3 times a year for students who are on grade level or above. And then our students that are facing challenges, we try to do that around 6 times a year, if at all possible. And it really allows us to monitor. State assessment is great. It's a great tool to use when you want to look at your district as far as how they stand with others. But when you really want to work with individual students, you need multiple data points. You can't just do that with one snapshot of one day of one school year. You need multiple snapshots. And so we really rely heavily on that data to let us know where we need to throw our extra resources in order to help our students.
Okay, so this is so interesting. So you're testing, you're getting results, and then you're looking at individual students. And I mean, what are some of those interventions? Is that like, hey, you're going to tutoring, you're going to go read for an extra hour a day?
Sometimes it is. You don't want to make
what does that look like?
Well, it looks a little different in every building because buildings have different resources. We try to pour most of our resources into our schools where our students might have some economic disadvantages.
Okay.
They seem to have more supports, but the data shows that they need those extra supports. And so our principals do a great job, especially at our elementary schools. They have monthly data meetings with teachers. And we bring in school psychometrists, we bring in counselors, and we look at each individual student that is not meeting benchmark. And we talk about what are some research-based strategies we can use with these students to help them make some pretty significant gains. I will tell you, because I know this question is going to come up, with our ESSER funding, we actually hired an additional interventionist teacher for all 25 of our elementary schools and all 6 of our junior highs. In addition, I purchased a really, what I feel is a real strong, scientifically based program, literacy and math program for those interventionists to use in small groups. So we had to do some really creative scheduling, but we're trying to pull those students out during the day into small groups and work through those programs. I won't wait until spring of 22 test data to see if that program's working. We actually look at that almost every single month. We pull benchmark data from those students who are attending that program. So far, I'm hopeful. I'm trying not to get too ahead of myself, but I am seeing some gains in those students. Our school administrators are seeing some gains in those students, and we're hopeful that that's making a difference.
Okay, and so like you mentioned with your kind of middle school age students, what are the kind of like social and emotional issues that you're seeing, and how is that playing into all of this? And is there a resource that you're applying to address that as well?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's another thing we used our ESSER funding for. We have hired some additional licensed therapists to work with our students in the schools. You know, students pick up on anything that's going on in the home with the adults in their lives. And this pandemic was very stressful. It brought out a lot of anxiety for health purposes. It brought out financial anxiety, and even things like the supply chain and being able to get your regular groceries and things at the grocery store creates anxiety when students see the adults in their lives um, stressing over those type of factors. And so we are really seeing a heightened anxiety level and also a little bit of apathy. I think maybe students having the opportunity to work at their own pace and not have to stay within the structure of a school schedule has built a little bit of apathy in our students. And so by adding those extra guidance counselors to those buildings, we're able to get into those classrooms and conduct a few more social and emotional learning lessons than we would have in the past. But to be honest with you, I think that it will take us longer to make up the social and emotional loss than even the academic loss. This is not going to be a sprint. This is going to be a marathon. And we're going to be making up for these losses for a very long time.
Wow, that's so fascinating. So talk to me about, you're kind of doing small groups. You're identifying on a regular basis how students that aren't meeting benchmark are doing. You're discussing them. What sorts of progress are you seeing, and in which areas? And sort of like, where are you seeing like, hey, we applied, a certain type of resource and it was immediately effective, or something along those lines?
Our math is a little slower, to be honest with you, than our English language arts. Our English language arts resources really delve into the science of reading. It's very easy to identify gaps with some of our readers, especially our early elementary readers. And we're really seeing some gains in the program we're using that really goes back to the basics of phonemic awareness, building into fluency. Our new favorite phrase is assess, don't assume. So we're conducting a lot of little mini assessments. We're not just assuming that students progress from one grade to the other with the skills they needed, because that probably didn't happen. And so we're really focusing on those little mini assessments and finding time in the day to go back and reteach. From a whole group perspective, we did have a lot of unfinished learning when we had to go home in the spring of 2020. And so we have some amazing curriculum coordinators here in Moore, and they worked all summer trying to find times in our normal pacing guide that we could fill in those holes and fill in those gaps and get that unfinished learning taken care of last year. More public schools, we started school on the first day. We were in school in person 5 days a week. But I don't want people to assume that meant we were business as usual. All of our mitigation efforts as far as social distancing, quarantining, contact tracing, it really did put a damper on what we know is effective teaching in the classroom. There's a certain set of skills that we know produce academic results, and there's a certain set of things we like to see in the classrooms that just couldn't take place because of social distancing. Things like collaborative and cooperative learning, teacher proximity, small groups, lots of kids sharing a lot of hands-on materials. Those things just couldn't happen last year. And so even though we were in school for 5 days, it was not a normal year. And we are still making up for that, like many of the districts that were virtual.
Okay. And that's interesting that you said that, because I think even just sort of reporting generally on schools, there's an assumption that Moore had, such an aggressive contact tracing program. And I know your superintendent used, it was probably CARES Act money at the time to get extra nurses in. And, Moore had a really aggressive, kind of contact tracing, a good online platform already established. And so your students had that smooth experience in ways that other students at other schools didn't. But still, you're saying that tough year.
Yes, it was not business as usual. And it still isn't to a certain extent. We're still working to get back to that place. And we look forward to the day that we can.
Okay. And is there anything else, Shannon, that, for this conversation, for this evening, as, we're kind of talking about, spending this ESSER money well, identifying individual students and their needs, and, what's possible in this moment in education. Is there anything else you want to add?
I would just say that there are a lot of outstanding commercial programs out there schools can use their ESSER dollars for. We've applied several this year that I've been very, very pleased with. But at the end of the day, there is nothing better than a highly qualified teacher working with a small group of students. That is where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck when it comes to student achievement. And we are finding that the teacher shortage is really hindering our efforts. When I had to hire 31 interventionists, I pulled 31 teachers out of the regular classroom, 31 superstar teachers,
Wow.
and they had to be replaced. Well, we just do not have the applicant pool we used to have. And so as a state, we're going to have to address this issue because it's only getting worse every year. And as I said, there are some great computer programs that you can put a student on, but as far as long-term effects and really working with kiddos, you really do need that adult, highly qualified teacher interaction.
Okay. Okay. Well, Shannon, thank you so much for being on with us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Just appreciate you so much and for your insights. All right. And coming up next, we have Superintendent Chris Brewster, and he is with Santa Fe South Schools. You have a great Christmas tree back there. I was noticing that earlier.
Thank you. My daughter is into decorating, and I'm into my daughter doing the decorating, so it works out.
Oh, fabulous. Okay, cool. It's very festive. Great. Well, Superintendent Brewster, thank you so much for being on. Kind of in line with the conversation we're having this evening, we're talking about data. We're talking about state assessment data, what it did and didn't say. We're talking about monitoring students as they progress this year. Moore has some interesting kind of, benchmark testing through the year, and they're applying resources as they get new information, which is interesting. And based on our conversation, I thought Santa Fe South would be an interesting guest in this show because the demographics of your student body are a little bit more, students tended to suffer a little bit more disproportionately during the pandemic. And I would like to talk about how that plays into your solutions and just kind of like what's going on with that community. First, maybe just tell me a little bit about your school.
Well, thanks for inviting us on. We appreciate it. We're a public charter school that serves just under 4,000 students in South Oklahoma City. We're celebrating our 20th year of existence, and yet many people don't even know we exist. We began in 2001 with 120 kids and 7 teachers, and now have 8 locations and 400 employees and nearly 4,000 kiddos that we serve. We are predominantly Hispanic students. About 92% of our kiddos claim Hispanic or non or white Hispanic origin and ethnicity. And around 94% of our kids would qualify for free or reduced lunch, meaning that the socioeconomic status of our families that we represent is toward the bottom of the economic earning scale in our state. We are a public school as a charter school, tuition free, and operate by filling every available seat. We have about 800 on our waiting list right now to come into our schools at different grade levels. And the population that we serve is a beautiful, hardworking, blue-collar, first and second generation immigrant population that deeply values education, deeply values hard work, and holds to the family very tightly. Many times the families we serve haven't had parental and grandparent or generational success academically, but they do really desire it for their children. And so they seek out other opportunities, and a charter school in many cases might be a perceived better fit for them. And that's the population we serve in South Oklahoma City. You sort of mentioned the pandemic, and the lead into this was sort of what the state data matrix is telling us about the net academic effect on student populations around the state. First of all, I commend our state for the type of work they've done to build this. It is an exceptional tool. It's top notch. I've been an educator since '92, and I've never seen a State Department that is more attuned to producing and providing accurate data for us to work with than our current State Department. So I appreciate Superintendent Hoffmeister and her team for doing what they're doing. You've heard the cautionary statements about testing percentages and those types of things. But I do think it's quite revealing that I guess I've looked at the pandemic in this way. We know that COVID-19 affected the physically or the physically fragile first and worst, and we know that it also affected the financially fragile first and worst. Many folks that have good physical health and were younger remain and were largely unaffected by COVID. Those that have financial positions or jobs that were unaffected by COVID's ravages still remain largely unaffected. And the academically fragile were also affected. And the population we serve most frequently in poverty-stricken communities would be considered, to my mind, an academically fragile population. So around our state, regardless of whether it's an urban or rural environment, or even suburban in some cases, those that are under-resourced tend to have been academically affected the most by this pandemic. The state data metrics and our internal measurements certainly affirm that. We have been able, because of some of the efforts we're able to do in some of the sort of more nimble nature of a smaller charter district like Santa Fe South, to make some decisions that have allowed us to mitigate some of the academic damage, but we're still a long ways from where we'd like to be. So that's sort of my basic preamble to this, and I'd be happy to talk about any other aspect of what we're doing at Santa Fe South with either ESSER funds or in response to what we see that the pandemic did to our kiddos.
Sure. Well, I appreciate that a lot, Superintendent Brewster. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about how your students are doing, because I think that's a good place to sort of get a pulse on before we start talking about solutions that you're seeing or trying out. So how are the kids?
I think that's the most important question. I appreciate you asking that because it can be answered on a lot of levels. One of our most important indicators is that we had a 95% retention rate through the pandemic. When many schools saw a sizable loss in population, many districts dropped, we not only maintained our full student complement of enrollment, but 95% of the students who are with us stayed with us. So we didn't lose them to online platforms or other types of schooling options. They stayed within our community. That told us a lot about what our families consider the value of Santa Fe South. We have a number of supports built in for counseling, for dealing with families that have struggled financially. We have tremendous partners in the community, ranging from church organizations that partner with us, nonprofits, both faith-based and government-based operations that we've been able to connect our families with. So the families and the children are doing quite well, just in general. The stress, though, has been tremendous on them academically. We have kiddos, obviously, that are pre-K, K, and 1 who've known no different than the pandemic. And it has a significant effect on them. The behavior of our kindergartners and our first graders is significantly behind the behaviors that are normally expected by those kiddos. They're just not quite school ready because they haven't been socialized. And so there's a lot of catching up. But interestingly enough, our seniors this year have had virtually no normal high school experience either. So we're talking about kids that have been radically affected in all kinds of ways, socially, emotionally, certainly academically. In schools, since we're called on to be full social service institutions instead of just academic institutions, we have to use our platforms to serve in all those areas.
Okay. And you talked a little bit about kind of community partnerships, which I think is going to be an interesting conversation moving forward as, the ESSER planning process calls for stakeholder input. I guess what are some of the contributions that, your community supports are making?
So I want to back up a little bit to something that Shannon said. One of her most poignant comments was about the essential nature of a high-quality teacher in each classroom.
Yeah.
And there is nothing that the research says has a more profound positive effect on kids than a highly qualified instructor. Not class size, not curriculum, not technology, not parent education rates. The singular most important thing that we can place in front of our children is a high highly talented and skilled teacher. At the same time, as she stressed, our hiring pool and our skill set among many of our educators is really, really stretched thin right now. So we're having to figure out how to shore that up both internally and externally. And one of the most, I think, remarkable partnerships that we've developed that has been provided through, and we do see a lot of opportunities, frankly, through this pandemic to grow and evolve our work. One of those is through a really dynamic partnership we have with the University of Oklahoma right now. In kind of looking around, as all of my co-administrators have done over the years, and really considered the most effective ways of developing student increases in student academics, one of the things that we know is that high dosage tutoring is really effective, especially with the population we serve. And for those that might not be familiar with that, and I certainly wasn't at the time, of course I know traditional tutoring, but high dosage tutoring is a very specific sort of protocol where tutoring is with trained tutors who have individual students in a one-on-one or one-on-two basis for 50 minutes at a time, 3 to 5 times per week, and most effectively administered when it's during the school day. So this is a highly concentrated effort to both identify where individual students and groups of students are academically, and then align intervention at all grade levels with a tutor who can work with them in a very regular and skilled design basis. So working with Dean Stacy Reeder in the College of Education at OU, and both through some of our ESSER funding and private philanthropic dollars, we've launched an extensive high dosage tutoring program at Santa Fe South. It's rolling out in 2 ways primarily right now, with the upper grade levels in math remediation with our 9th graders, and in our earliest grade levels in pre-K, K, and 1 in literacy. And in both of those contexts, we're already seeing remarkable results with those kiddos who've been able to have a reliable, trained tutor meeting with them 3 to 5 times per week. So that the design of this has been a real labor of love and expertise from OU and our staff as well. And we expect that we're going to be able to show the empirical data from this pilot project that would encourage policymakers in other districts, and then frankly private donors, to contribute to us being able to support the work of teachers inside the classroom by providing this aspect of tutoring both outside and within the class day. So that's one of the highlights of our ESSER expenditures. There's many other things that we're doing, but that's one of the main things we're focusing on right now.
Wow, that I'm excited to see that. I'm excited to see the outcome of that. And will there be maybe like something in the legislature this session, or I guess where's that headed, that pilot project?
Well, that's an interesting question. We've got a full team of researchers through OU who will be gathering the data and analyzing whether or not it's an efficacious program. I don't know that would be prepared, or that we'd have the depth of data that we'd need for this legislative session. But there's certainly going to be some evidence to be considered for those that are interested in that type of work. And we'd be happy to visit with those. And I'm sure that Dean Reeder and her team at OU would as well. In addition to the tutoring program, we were already engaged at Santa Fe South in a very aggressive academic improvement plan, a 5-year plan with a 3-year roadmap called our AOA plan, which indicates that we would like to have all of our students at or above the national average in reading and math, as measured by the NWEA MAP test. It's a proprietary test that's used across the country and has a very large norm referencing student population. So we can really gauge whether or not our students in South Oklahoma City are performing at the level of their peers all around the nation. We were able to hire a chief academic officer with a tremendous track record of success, and a team of specialists who've redesigned curriculum, common assessments, implemented a very aggressive data gathering platform, and our protocols for both instructional design, our academic calendars, our curriculum, and then our ongoing assessments, both our common assessments and our benchmark assessments, has proven to be a remarkably successful intervention already. So by 2024 in the spring, we expect to have all of our students at or above grade level. It's easy to say, but we can't really find any other schools in the nation who don't control for student inputs by testing certain students and allowing them in magnet schools, for example, or selection schools. We can't find other schools that have been able to achieve this over time. So we're very excited for the standard to be set with the kids we're working with, and feel we have the staff and the support team to see that happen. ESSER funding has been a tremendous boon to that, allowing us about a 3-year on-ramp to get that rolling before we have to figure out how to support those with local dollars or other ways to fund these positions.
Okay. Fascinating. Well, I'll definitely be, following, kind of both of those initiatives. Very exciting. Superintendent Brewster, talk to me a little bit about, I guess, what you are, what are you hoping for your students when you see assessment results at the end of this year? I mean, what are you looking forward to at the end of the school year as you're kind of aggressively applying these, new solutions, new programs, more staff, these tutoring hours, which I think are really interesting? Kind of, I guess, what do you hope to see?
Well, the ultimate goal at Santa Fe South is to produce a school community of educators that are the finest in the nation. And we know that as we pour ourselves into developing, supporting, and recruiting the highest quality teaching talent possible, the students that we work with will achieve these academic results. The test results are going to be an affirmation, but we already know that the most important thing we can do is develop this teaching core. It is also the most challenging thing. It's easy to buy technology and buy Chromebooks and to buy more curriculum. It's easy to throw things at problems, but the most important work that we do as educational leaders is to foster a climate of academic excellence on the part of our instructional leaders and our classroom instructors. So the work that we're doing right now, we do expect to see it result, has already begun to see some really significant results by mid-year MAP scores that we're just rolling out this week. And what I enjoy most about that is seeing that my teachers' incredible work is being affirmed now in test scores. And so it helps them to be able to relax into the hard work and not be anxious that time is spent or misspent on certain techniques when they start to see the affirmation and what their students can do. And it's, we were just looking at data, in fact, today that's just rolling right out of our testing protocols and seeing tremendous results. I'll tell you one story. One of my daughters, all of my children have gone to Santa Fe South schools. We transferred them into the schools that I lead. And one of my daughters, adopted daughters, had some real academic challenges in mathematics and was very discouraged by math. But this year, she's a part of a really aggressive academic improvement strategy for kids in math. And she's kind of had her head down and just felt defeated. But today, she took her MAP test in math, and she didn't even want to tell me what she got because she didn't really believe that she had done that well. And she's already seeing mid-year gains in 3 months that are more than 1 year's gains in the entire year. So she's more than doubled what we expect her to already. So as a dad, I could not be more excited for my child to come back and feel that affirmation that her work is starting to pay off as well.
Oh, that's a great story. I don't think we talk about it enough, like how frustrated the kids must feel knowing that they're having a hard time, or they sat in front of a computer for way too long and or struggled to try to focus at home. I mean, that's a great story. Good for her. Props to her. Superintendent Brewster, is there anything else you want to add for this evening?
Well, again, this is not a magic bullet. Our adults in the equation, our teachers, principals, parents, legislators, those in the community, we have to circle around our kids. And the way we conceptualize this in some of the circles that I run is pretty simple. What if we were the best state in the nation to raise a child? What would it look like if Oklahoma were the very best place in the nation to raise a child? Well, it would mean that our health indicators for children would be the best, that our academic outcomes in the nation would be the best, that our kids' family structures would be the strongest, that we would look at things like policy and business and other things, and we would develop those and permit those with an eye toward what does this do for the children that we serve? And I'm excited to see the people that I work with at Santa Fe South, our families, our community, our church partners, our higher ed partners, our business partners, our philanthropic partners. They're banding together to really ensure that thousands of kids have a better opportunity because of the work they're doing. And I'm excited to be doing the work and love working around educators. Man, I appreciate you taking the time to cover this type of work in depth.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thank you so much for being on this evening and for all the great work that you're doing at Santa Fe South. And looking forward to hearing more about some of the programs that you've got in the works right now.
Well, thanks again, and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. You have a good rest of your evening. All righty. And next we have Mustang Public Schools Director of Federal Programs, Marva Ord. And Marva, we've had kind of a little marathon of information about this topic this evening. I guess what have you been thinking about your peers and their insights and their inspiration to help students?
Well, I'm
feeling kind of moved myself.
I loved what Maria had to say, so cautionary about using our data wisely, not comparing ourselves to others, just trying to make certain that we see our students grow. Part of my title is also Director of Student Assessments. And so I see both worlds, how we use our federal dollars to support our students, but also our state and local testing that we do within Mustang schools and the data that we get from that. We all are doing very similar things that, the benchmark assessments that we do, probably maybe not necessarily using the same vendors, but the intent is the same, to look at each child individually and see where they're at and where we can take them. We were in school for the most part, but we did have students that chose virtual. And unfortunately, last year when they chose virtual, they did not choose the new Mustang virtual program. And so we were put in the position of having a marked decrease in growth, where we've always been the last several years one of the largest growing districts in the state. And district leadership was committed to not losing any of our teachers. We have exemplary teachers on our staffs at our schools and wanted to retain those teachers at all cost. Our ESSER money has allowed us to do that. And so this year school starts back and we've gained over 1,300 students. And
Wow.
So the stresses that we had prior to were different. We're trying to keep teachers in classrooms. We don't want to let go of any of our teachers. We're all like family. And then all of these new students come in, so we're charged with finding more teachers, places to put them. We've been able to use our ESSER and CARES money to buy supplies for classrooms so that we can be cautionary with COVID, that children are using separate supplies. They're not having to bring additional materials from home, trying to do that, the purchase of portable classrooms so that we can keep those class sizes down. Because we have this exorbitant growth, but we also, they've counseled us with the COVID dollars, the ESSER money. It's prepare, prevent, and respond. And so that's the way we've tried to use our money. Are we preparing our classrooms? Are we trying to prevent the spread of the virus? How are we responding to what we know is a transmission, but keeping our students comfortable? It's allowed us to, ESSER money has allowed us to purchase social emotional learning software and a package that we use throughout our sites, training teachers, supporting students, and even supporting our teachers, because while this has been hard on our students, it's been hard on our teachers. It's been emotionally and physically exhausting for them, and they are in there every day giving everything they can for kids. And so we're grateful for that, and we've tried to really do our part to prepare them for what they're going to encounter in the classroom. But it's interesting to see the two pieces come together. We've done data presentations for our school board this year, and looking at that data, of course we want to go look at what we consider our sister schools, who looks like us as far as demographics. The state of Oklahoma has done a remarkable job with their new data matrix, Oklahoma School Report Cards. where you can go look up. I have grandchildren. I like to go look at the schools that they will attend, and are they doing a good job supporting students and growing students? And so that's been a help for us. It's brought questions to us. What can we do? More, different tutoring programs. As I said, the purchase of additional supplies and materials. I was in an office today where they're putting together 3,000 take-home packages for third and fourth graders of materials that these kiddos can practice just basic mathematics and reading. A marker, a dry erase marker, and dice, and laminated papers to write on and erase and go try these fun but crucial games that our students can use over the break. That's how vested we are. And what did we use to purchase that? We've braided district funds, state funds, ESSER funds, and it's allowed us to do things like that.
Wow. And definitely an interesting moment in Mustang schools. Is the district having any issues bringing in new teachers with the teacher shortage?
Oh, it's a struggle everywhere. It is. And we are very blessed that we are considered a top 10 workplace in the state. And I believe I'm saying that correctly, and that people do want to work in Mustang, but there are signing bonuses in other districts. Our more rural schools have smaller class sizes. And so that takes some of the stress off of a teacher, especially a new teacher. And so it is a struggle. We have a pretty remarkable HR department that even when we were trying to recruit in the middle of the pandemic, how can we do that virtually? How can we bring teachers and principals together to meet, but do so safely so that they can have those interviews? And especially, we like to team interview in Mustang. Very seldom does someone interview alone. And so to make those things happen and make certain that everyone's got the skills, knows how to effectively use Google to host a meeting, that sort of thing. But it is a struggle for us as well.
Marva, talk to me a little bit about what assessment data, either state assessment data or some of the vendor benchmark data that the district uses.
We do very similarly to Moore. We benchmark 3 times a year for our students that have given us evidence of struggles. We benchmark 6 times a year. We do what's called progress monitoring with them. We are able to run class and individual reports, grade level reports. We can look at our data, from a big group down to a single student. We try to make certain that the appropriate personnel have access to the data without violating FERPA. We want to maintain confidentiality and be protective of our students and our teachers as much as we can. But we have support systems. If you look at our intermediate and middle schools, we have what's called care classes, and the other one just completely walked out of my brain. But support classes for our students, enrichment classes, skill builders is the other one. So that they get those supports that they need, and they're, I don't want to say routinely shuffled because that seems almost cold-hearted, but they are evaluated, and it's the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 that the students are placed so that they get the level of support that they need. In my position, I'm a career math teacher, but it's very exciting for me to sit back and see what we're doing in classrooms. I deal with the numbers side of it, the data from assessments, the dollars from federal programs, and our CFO, Nancy McKay, does a pretty remarkable job with our state and local funds, which is the majority of our budget. But it's exciting to sit on those team meetings and hear what is going on to support students, the way that we look at data. The assessment instrument that we use has a custom piece. And so when we see a gap, we can go create a custom assessment for that group of students and reevaluate as we move on with instruction in other areas while providing supports for that. And our teachers are very willing. We've asked a lot of them over the last 2.5 years as far as technology and learning new things and how to implement. One more time, in Mustang, they've done a remarkable job. and so it's pretty awesome.
Okay. And maybe tell me a little bit more about how is your district addressing, we've just touched a little bit on social and emotional development tonight in this conversation, and using ESSER money to support students and support, teachers. Talk a little bit about what that is looking like right now in Mustang.
That's probably one of the things that I've not been trained on as much as others. We do use a program. I probably shouldn't mention the name. I don't want to give anybody a plug, but we do have a program that we started using a couple of years ago. The ESSER money has allowed us to invest into it more, where we maybe have just bought a basic package and some of the bells and whistles. We've really dived into it deeply. Our school counselors are very aware of our struggling students, and they're the ones that could really give more of an in-depth idea of what it looks like to apply some of the practices that they've gained from this program and some of the ways that we provide supports. But they've received hours of training. Classroom teachers have received hours of training over the last couple of years on flags. We all know what red flags are for students who are troubled, but I think this pandemic has caused some of our students to be more internal than external with their emotions. And so, what does that look like for teachers, and what does that look like for our school counselors? I know that, we task our school counselors with being building test coordinators and that sort of thing. Yeah. We've added to their plate by doing what, of course, they feel like is their number one job, and that's caring for kids. But at the same time, our counselors are typically academic counselors. And so they maybe don't always get to have those academic moments with students that we had 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. We were fortunate enough in Mustang to receive one of the counselor corps grants, which is some ESSER money.
Sure.
We put in for that and hired a recreational therapist, some licensed mental health professionals, and a social worker to strengthen up our counseling staff across the district with some of those skills that a typical school counselor would not have, and you wouldn't expect to have. And so that has been a real bonus for us, that we've had these people come in who are very competent and very educated on how to cope with and help our students cope with some of those deep-seated issues that some of them might be having.
Okay. And maybe, Marva, as we wrap up our conversations this evening, tell me about one federal program that you're most excited about in terms of, it's innovative, it's cool, or maybe by the end of this spring,
this is really somebody else's. But I've only been doing federal programs for Mustang about the last year and a half. I've had some prior experience through some other districts with federal programs, but it was determined just before I came on board in May of 20 that we would look at our Title VI, which is Indian education, that we would take a look at that and maybe do some things differently to support those kiddos. We do have a large Native population in Mustang schools, and we're very proud of their culture and their heritage, and are working hard to develop that. And so we have in place Katie Patterson, who is our Native American facilitator for the district. And she's just worked tirelessly to make certain that our students have what they need in relation to their tribes, but also at school, promoting ACT with vouchers for them for ACT testing, ACT boot camp, for our younger kiddos, making certain that they have books about culture in their hands, that they are proud of where they come from and where their families come from, and that they know that we're proud that they're a part of Mustang schools with their heritage. And so that's one of our programs that we've seen a real mind shift in, and are very excited about that. The other one probably is our English language population, our English language learners. Our population over the last 7 years has doubled. And I think that's true for any district in the state, in the metro area. We're very glad to welcome those students to our district, and we are in the throes of reevaluating that program. are we effective enough? What can we do differently? We have a pull out program from the classroom. Should we be pushing into the classroom more? Is the curriculum that we use appropriate? I said it on a webinar today to look at another potential avenue of curriculum that maybe would further our students' language skills faster. Language acquisition comes easy for the younger students, but the grammar and the mechanics behind it, the literacy piece, not always so much. And so those are two federal programs that, while they're not our largest population, of course, Title I, our free and reduced kiddos are our largest population, but they are a population that we feel like we need to have our eyes on more. And so we're pretty excited to at least have the opportunity to look at what we're doing and do that self-analysis to see if we can't do better for the support that we give to those students.
Okay. And I think we should end this conversation on question of equity, which Maria talked about a little bit. Status assessment data is a civil rights check, like she said. And for, you're talking about federal dollars that are being directed toward certain populations of students in order to give them an equitable opportunity at a Mustang Schools education. Maybe talk to me a little bit about what equity looks like in Mustang Schools in terms of the pandemic and in terms of the ESSER dollars that are being applied.
When you look at our overall demographics for Mustang, we are not terribly diverse. We don't have a large population of Hispanic students or Native students, but we do have those students. And as I said, our largest population, when we think about diversity, are our students that are economically disadvantaged. But our other kiddos fall into that group. And so when we look across our district, we'd like to believe we're colorblind. We really do. We want the best for every one of our kiddos. And when you think about, we never want a student to be a number. We never want a student to be a test score. And so when we talk about test scores and measuring where they're at and where they're going, that's all well and good. But at the end of the day, that child has a heart and they're a person. And that's what we want them to do, is to be an adult that is kind and caring and models those things that we hope we as adults model. And so how do we support them? Well, we take those burdens off of them that they might be facing, whether it's, a free breakfast or a free lunch or school supplies or contact with their tribal membership so that there's assistance that they can get there. That's what we want to do. We want to relieve those burdens so that we can help them have that leg up and achieve that equity. I don't think anybody really understands privilege until they're on the other end of it. and so for us to address that, I think, is very difficult because that's not something we've had to go through. But I do believe that in Mustang, we support all students, but we are very careful and cautious to support those students who need it the most and make certain that we don't let them fall through the cracks.
Okay. Well, Marva, thank you so much.
I'm kind of get emotional about it.
Oh, I know, this was such a, this conversation is hard, and it just touches on, kids going through just an unimaginable year. And, you never want to think that, some of the implications of this pandemic are going to last a lifetime. And so I think this question of what's going on right now this year in schools to mitigate, losses from the pandemic, and the kids who had it doubly worse for whatever was going on at home, is just, it is, I would feel a little bit of
there will always be stories
heart behind
from
it,
our
for
students
sure.
that we will not hear because we don't know what went on at home. Our families that are multi-generational, that, more than one family under the roof. I don't think that we can ever truly understand, because that's not the way we live. It's my husband and myself, and sometimes we feel crowded with each other. But the things that we've asked our children to cope with and to grow in spite of, and you know what? They're doing it.
Kids are so adaptable. I think that's been...
They're doing it. And that doesn't mean that we still don't need to give them supports and, okay, well, you're fine, we're just going on. That's not the
Right.
case at all, because fine one day may not be fine the next day.
Truly. Okay. Well, thank you so much again, Marva.
Not a
And
problem. Glad to join you tonight. And
Yeah,
happy
I just-
holidays.
yes, happy holidays, Merry Christmas. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye. All right, everyone. We just wrapped up episode 2 of our series, Filling in the Gaps. We're talking about the meaningful ways that schools, State Department of Ed are stepping up and applying some new interventions, some currently being tested interventions to finish learning for students who dealt with a very difficult year during the pandemic. And thank you so much for everybody who's been on. Next week, we'll be back here at 7 p.m. For another episode of Filling in the Gaps. And this is Education Watch Oklahoma. I want to say a big thank you to Scott Mitchell, who is producing the show behind the scenes. He's been so wonderful and supportive of this effort. And then Ryan Welton, our digital guru at News 9 and News on 6. He is also supporting this from behind the scenes. And you heard his wonderful music in the introduction to this show. So again, this is Education Watch Oklahoma. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any ideas, insights, feedback for the show. I would love to hear from you. Have a good rest of your evening.